At the time, the experts were claiming, this is 1999, that there'd been 250,000 deaths in that year alone, in South Africa alone. And so it struck me that if one could verify that that was true, it was obscene even to continue the debate, and that if I could prove that, which I thought was just a matter of a phone call or two, it would end the debate, and the denialists and President Mbeki would have to sort of retreat into the corner and wear dunce caps. So I went out and started looking for corpses, and that's many years ago, and I'm still looking today.
And you didn't find the corpses?
It's an ambiguous question, but I'd clearly say that at that time, these claims from the United Nations that I think the experts were completely wrong at that period. I think that that was hysteria.
What about today?
Today the situation is more complicated. I mean, after years of looking at this thing, I've learned one thing, is that science is actually political, and that in this huge AIDS debate that rages in South Africa, that there is ultimately no truth, and that you might as well rely on stories that you hear from friends and the messages that you get from your bones. So in 1999, the messages I was getting from my bones and from friends is that in Johannesburg, AIDS deaths were almost invisible. They were...
Did you find the corpses?
I didn't, and I believe that the claims then emanating from the AIDS establishment were entirely preposterous.
But how can you say that when millions of children, millions of men and women, and orphans have been said to die from AIDS?
Well, let's just step back and look at the broad picture. When I was still naive about AIDS, I used to open the newspaper and I'd read that some astronomical and dumbfounding number of Africans was infected with HIV, 24 million, 30 million, whatever. So what you discover is this doesn't imply that that many people have actually been tested. is what has happened is that it's assumed that that many Africans is theoretically connected via tortuous mathematical models to a woman who tested positive in a government survey. Now these surveys take place every year in most African countries, and what I call the AIDS boinas, researchers will go to government pregnancy clinics and take blood from women. If a particular number of them test positive under these very cursory testing regimes that they do there, that data is then put into computer models, which at the far end will spew out estimates. They will translate the raw data from pregnancy clinics, the number of women who are HIV positive there, into countrywide statistics that offer theoretical estimates for the number of people infected, theoretical estimates of the number of people who have died, and theoretical estimation of the armies of orphans they've left in their wake. While UNAIDS was saying there'd been 250,000 deaths, the experts now, the AIDS establishment, the conventional wisdom now would be that there were around 50,000. In a country with 40 million people, 50,000 deaths can easily go astray. I'm not a scientist. It seemed to me that if what the experts were saying was true, that 250,000 South Africans died of AIDS in 1999, that settled the issue. It would be obscene even to continue the debate. If that was true, if so many people were dying, it seemed that the dissidents... If it was true that so many people were dying, it just seemed to me that the dissidents should crawl into a corner and that our president should join them there, and the debate should be closed immediately. I mean, it seemed to me, look, I'm a layman, I don't understand science, it was way above my head. I said, look, these experts are saying there's this new disease, it's stalking in Africa, it's an invisible killer, everyone in South Africa's got it, 250,000 people died of it last year, and I don't understand the science. I said, but I will. I have sufficient intelligence to go and attempt to verify these claims about the death rate. So I started looking for corpses, and I'm still looking today. But if you stand back and you look at the broad African picture, in the rest of Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, those deaths are theoretical. They're taking place in computer models.
What do you mean theoretical? In computer models?
If you read in the New York Times that 2 or 5 million Africans died of AIDS last year, it doesn't mean that many people have died and their corpses have been counted. It means that these people are supposedly linked, theoretically linked via tortuous mathematical models to women who've tested positive in these sort of cursory government pregnancy clinic surveys. I mean, ultimately, the view of the AIDS plague that we get from Europe, from Geneva, from the United Nations, is it's a theoretical construct. The only place in the whole of Africa, if not the third world, where it's possible to verify the accuracy or otherwise of those claims is here in South Africa. This is the battleground. For the rest, in the rest of Africa, you can make up anything that you want and nobody would ever be any the wiser. Africa is to a considerable extent unknowable. There's no infrastructure, government is weak, no deaths are registered. So you can say whatever you like and nobody can ever gainsay you. We'll return to that in a moment.
So are you saying that there is no AIDS epidemic here?
My position is, I believe that AIDS exists, I believe it's a problem. I'm not a dissident. I've seen people start taking the drugs and rise up from their deathbeds and walk. My position is that, to the very best of my knowledge, that the AIDS problem in South Africa and Africa in general has been hugely exaggerated. You know, if you step back and look at the picture, Africa is in many ways an unknowable place. These numbers aren't real. They're theoretical. They're generated by computer models which attempt to estimate the extent of the problem.
What do you mean theoretical? Are you saying that those deaths didn't actually occur?
This is I can't give you a yes or no answer on that. This is a Buddhist thing. You have to. This subject requires the wisdom of a Buddhist. You have to be able to hold two possibilities in your brain at the same time. It's very difficult for most people to do. I can tell you this, however. There are no statistics elsewhere in Africa. They simply don't exist. There are simply estimates generated by people who have a vested interest in keeping this, in portraying Africa's AIDS problem as dumbfounding as possible. The sole exception is this country, South Africa. South Africa is the only country in Africa that has anything remotely approaching a vital registration system on the basis of which you can draw conclusions. So you're going to ask me about the numbers in the rest of Africa. I don't know. You can make up anything you want about most countries in Africa. Nobody would be any the wiser. It's almost impossible to check. You can sit in Geneva with your computer and generate estimates of whatever nature. They remain theoretical. This is the battleground. South Africa is the exception. It's the only country in the entire third world where it's possible to assess the accuracy of these theoretical estimates against real-life death registration.
And what do you find when you assess the accuracy of these models, these estimates?
Complicated question. My position is that when I finished my first piece about AIDS in Africa, I'd met lots of very interesting people who were regarded as dissidents, who didn't believe HIV theory. I'd sort of canvassed their side of the story, and I'd also spoken to people on the other. When this was all said and done, and I'd written a piece about the statistics in Africa, I wrote letters to these people, some of whom I regarded as friends. They were very interesting. Their lungs hungered for the fierce oxygen of truth. I said to them, guys, I've listened to you and I'm afraid that I've got a major problem with what you're saying. Because unless you can explain the alarming increase in registered deaths in South Africa that started taking place around 1998, I'm not going to believe you. You can maybe convince me that this isn't AIDS, that it's some sort of mutant form of TB or something, but you need to offer an explanation. Meanwhile, I look at these graphs put forward by South African AIDS researchers, and I look at the second hump on graphs of female mortality, and I say, I'm sorry, that looks like AIDS to me. It's exactly... Interestingly, I did that, and a lot of them stopped talking to me, but one, Rodney Richards, took up this challenge, and for the last 5 years Rodney and I have been discussing what truths are really revealed by South African death rate. Let me see. When I sent this letter to the dissidents, most of them sort of turned their back on me. The sole exception was Rodney Richards. And, you know, Rodney actually took up this challenge. I thought it was completely impossible. Here you're looking at Himalayas of death in graphs of South African mortality. And he wasn't a glib answer. He's worked on this for years. His knowledge of South African death registration statistics probably excludes those of anyone else in the world. And he has been able to formulate a counter-argument that nobody in the orthodoxy, in the establishment, will address. He will write papers, detailed papers, critiquing the orthodox view of South African death registration, and they will pass peer review at the South African Medical Journal, meaning that they cannot be faulted scientifically, but somehow they never get published. The last time that happened was they said, well, there's too little space. So Yes, Rodney, like all the dissidents, has been completely marginalized, but I believe, look, I've got to call it as I see it. I'm not a dissident. I believe people are dying of AIDS. I believe it's a serious problem in South Africa. I believe, though, that throughout Africa it's been hugely exaggerated. And beyond that, wherever the truth will arrive, I mean, I don't know the truth. I'm a journalist. I've been out asking questions, and there are a lot of questions that the people will come and tell you that hundreds of thousands of South Africans are dying of AIDS just refuse to answer.
What kind of questions do you ask?
Well, let me tell you a story that they won't tell you. In the dark ages of apartheid in this country behind us, most Africans were reconciled to blacks-only areas, rural areas where there was desperate poverty, diseases of poverty were rife, infant mortality was rife. The government in Pretoria did not want anyone to know what death rates were in those areas. So consequently, when Nelson Mandela came to power in 1994, death registration in those areas was almost non-existent. The ANC government regarded it as very important to include previously invisible people in their statistics. So they started in 1998 a major countrywide campaign, ongoing campaign, to encourage the poor and the marginalized people to register their deaths. The year that program started, there was this very noticeable upsurge in registered deaths in South Africa. The AIDS guys looked at this and said, see, this is it. This is the long-predicted plague we're coming. Here's the double upswing on the second part of the curve. This is AIDS causing it. A guy like Rodney would say, on the contrary, the most likely explanation of this is that the apparent rise in mortality is an illusion generated by improving completeness of death registration. Are your eyes glazing over? Should I try and explain that simpler? Let's say that you have an island in which 100 deaths take place every year, but completeness of death registration is only 20%. That means your statistics would show that 20 deaths took place. If, however, a government decided they want to change this and register every death that happened, and that death registration rises over a period to 100%, you're going to see in the statistics a massive increase in mortality. But it would be an illusion. It's not real. It's just simply that the counting has improved.
And so you're saying that the AIDS establishment jumped on this and said this is the proof that AIDS is now demolishing this country.
Correct. They.
Is AIDS an epidemic?
Let me say this: is what the AIDS Boanas did is they ignored the underlying. This government campaign that I'd mentioned in 1990, what the AIDS establishment did was they completely ignored government efforts to improve registration. They do not mention that at all in any of the literature, which is an astonishing sort of. If you look at South Africa in the microcosm, if you go, I can take you to a place in rural KwaZulu where desperately poor people live in mud huts. 10 years ago, when their father died, they would have, if they'd wanted to, they would have had to trek 50 miles to go and report that death to government. Why bother? There's no point, right? Now that's changed completely. The government has pulled tribal authorities into the registration progress. The Department of Home Affairs has opened satellite offices all over these areas. You can now go down 5 miles to the nearest village and you can register the death there. And if you register the death there, the undertaker who registers your death, if you're indigent and you can't pay for it, he can apply to the government to subsidize the cost of your burial. This is very expensive in South Africa. This is like, it seems completely illogical to me, just as a sort of ordinary human being, that programs like this had no impact on death registration. But as I say, I mean, people like Zaki Ahmad would look at me and roll their eyes and say that I'm mad, or else that I'm evil, or some sort of Nazi denialist. But I mean, I'm completely convinced that the AIDS establishment has gone out of its way to ignore alternative explanations of what's going on in South Africa.
What about cultural icons like Bono and other celebrities who come here and they pour out their heart and they give their time to fight this epidemic, to fight all these people that are said to have died from AIDS and people suffering and who will die from AIDS? Are you saying that they're just wasting their time?
No, I'm sure Bono's heart is in the right place. He probably reads the New York Times and believes what it tells him about AIDS in Africa. Consequently, he thinks he's doing the right thing. But you must bear in mind that two things about this sort of intervention. First of all, human beings get paid in many forms of coinage. One of the coinages that is very common in Africa is love and gratitude of people who are absolutely desperate. can be very intoxicating for a guy who comes from Ireland and is a rock and roll star. Something that you're not going to get elsewhere in the world where people are cynical. And the second thing would be, since you asked the question, the guys like Bono and Bob Geldof, they totally wed to this idea that Africans are completely useless victims and can't do anything unless the great big white Bwanas come in and help them. If I was an African, I look at this thing and I'm slightly skeptical. I mean, I just wonder. I often think that that the guys like that, they, in the back of their mind, they have an audience. And the audience is looking and nodding approvingly and say, that's a great man, that's a man who really cares about his fellow human beings.
Okay.
I mean, I think the interventions that work in Africa and that are longer lasting are not that easy. It's not as easy as showing sympathy and compassion. It's a question of devoting your life to really hard work in awful places.
What thoughts come to mind when you hear the words HIV and AIDS?
In my case, HIV is an X in my brain. It reminds me of countless months, years that I've wasted poring over science papers I don't understand in search of a truth that appears to be elusive.
What thoughts come to your mind when you hear the words HIV and AIDS?
When I think of HIV and AIDS, I see dollar signs and vexation.
Do you think Africa focuses too much on AIDS?
I think what you have to look, I think the obsession of the outside world, the rich countries, with AIDS in Africa is very unhealthy for Africans. Because the underlying logic of the AIDS activist is that because Mr. Mahlangu, who lives in a rural village in Zambia, has a disease that rich white people are interested in, somebody should spend $600 a year keeping him alive with antiretrovirals. This is a noble idea, and I'm not going to gainsay it, but it's slightly absurd if you consider that almost everyone else on Mr. Mahlangu's street might be dying of AIDS or TB, or of diseases can be cured for almost nothing if there was a health service, if there was money, if there were drugs at the hospital. In many parts of Africa, including South Africa, those things do not exist. So I think that the emphasis on AIDS creates huge distortions in African spending priorities. If the purpose of governments is to help people, to cure their sick and so forth, we need to have very careful discussions about how money is spent and where it goes. And what the AIDS activists seek to do is they seek to abrogate this debate entirely and hijack all available resources for their single cause. Well, I think that the consequences of this distortion are that billions and billions, untold billions, get poured into AIDS prevention and AIDS research. And diseases like TB, which is probably a larger killer than AIDS, get ignored almost entirely. The last time I checked this out, it appeared that the differential between AIDS research and TB research spending was 100 to 1. People who work in malaria will tell you the same thing. Malaria is a cheap and easy drug to cure. You can achieve wonders in terms of cutting infant mortality rates simply by providing people with an insecticide impregnated mosquito net. Costs almost nothing. But those sort of things don't happen. There isn't money for that, but there's an awful lot of money for AIDS conferences and AIDS interventions of this sort or that. Can I say something else?
Go ahead.
The government of Botswana at one stage, a year or two ago, was planning to spend 9 billion pula. That's about $3 billion over the next 5 years on AIDS. Most of this money was for prevention. Not for drugs for sick people, I support that, but for prevention, the soft interventions. Now, how do you prevent AIDS and raise consciousness about it in a country where, for example, high school students are said to be so tired of having sort of visitors from overseas walking into their classrooms to lecture them about condoms that when it happens, they ball up wads of paper and throw it at you, and they jeer and they shout. In other words, everyone in Botswana knows about AIDS. Everyone has been propagandized about it. People know that that if they're going to play fast and loose sexually, that they might die. So, what are these? I believe that I could run a pretty good prevention campaign, a propaganda campaign on behalf of AIDS for $1 million a year. A very effective one. A one that really, here they want to spend hundreds of times that. And nobody seems to query these things. If you stand up and query these expenses, then you're some sort of nutcase, or you're a moral leper, that you're willing people to die, or you're somehow complicit in the deaths of these millions of people who are theoretically dying every year. I don't buy it. I'm sorry, I don't. Then.
And what would you do with that $1 million for a propaganda campaign for AIDS?
I would organize better newspaper coverage of a story that was based on anecdote and not experts, because people only understand issues through the experience of other people. So I'd drop all the issues. I wouldn't quote any of these experts. I'd ignore the experts from overseas and the people who help themselves to the grants. And the second thing I'd do is every now and then I'd run a newspaper ad that was really effective, and I'd make sure it was talked about on radio, and I think that'd be adequate. The rest of it is a preposterous waste of money. What happens if you stand up, if you draw attention as a journalist to any good news about the plague, is that you're deemed to be morally deficient, that you are that you're sowing confusion and you're providing oxygen for these awful denialists, and finally that you're derailing these 100,000 really worthy fundraising campaigns. So you are evil if you say things are good. For example, in 2005, the South African Human Sciences Research Council did a completely groundbreaking sort of survey to try and establish what real HIV prevalence was in South Africa. They'd already established that it was much lower than the UNAIDS claimed. The second survey of theirs, their previous survey had yielded the following verdicts: that 6% of white South Africans were HIV positive, that 11% of their children were HIV positive, and a similar picture in all the racial minorities in South Africa. That is catastrophe. 11% of children, that's awful. That was greeted by shock new findings, headlines in the newspaper, white South Africa doomed, etc. 3 years later, a new piece of research showing that the tests were defective and that somehow come out with white HIV prevalence estimated falls tenfold. In the Western Cape, 5 out of 6 presumed HIV infections disappear. Not a word about it in the South African newspapers. Not a word.
How has the West, particularly the United States, influenced the African perspective of AIDS?
I'd say that if you go to a country like Tanzania, which is desperately poor, or Uganda, the rural districts, people are very poor, they're very ill-educated, they have no access to the sophisticated media that we take for granted. So here you're living in a mud hut, and here some kind of white men with doctors who you respect. Everyone knows that they're very powerful wizards, and they tell you that there is now among you an invisible disease, and it gets into your blood and can stay there unseen for years. And when it manifests itself, it's going to manifest itself in the forms of diseases you've always known, i.e. TB, dysentery, the commonplace diseases of Africa. I think that this cannot help but create extraordinary paranoia in people's minds. They say, well, what is going on with us? My neighbor next door he's got malaria. Does that mean that he's actually got this dreadful disease that the whites are talking about? I think that some of the claims made about Africa, especially about the Great Lakes region, at a time when Peter Piot of UNAIDS would acknowledge that tests were totally defective and the predictions made were disastrously incorrect. I think that they traumatized the psyches of entire nations with claims that we now know are not right, and they never said sorry. And I think previously, especially in rural Africa, people are unsophisticated. They tend to believe in witchcraft. Any misfortune that befalls you is frequently interpreted as the actions either of malevolent spirits unleashed on you by enemies, or by the spirits of your ancestors who are displeased with something that you've done. So I would imagine that if you went to the village of Kasansero, which is supposed to be ground zero for the AIDS pandemic in Africa, before this disease had even been identified, and if it is indeed true that people were dying in large numbers of strange unexplained diseases, people would have said witchcraft. To this day in South Africa, the most sophisticated country in Africa, any disease is still frequently attributed to witchcraft.
In your opinion, is AIDS Africa's biggest problem?
Now, I can't answer that question until they get the science right. All I've learned from 6 years of studying the subject is that science is political and people reach preconceived conclusions in order to forward their ideological positions. As we stand here today, let's first address the rest of Africa. The Washington Post this year ran an article that sounded rather like me. They concluded they surveyed the available evidence in Rwanda, which was held forth in the 1980s as the epicenter of the AIDS pandemic in Africa, the fountain of death, according to Vanity Fair. These guys have now checked out the history of this thing, and I quote the Washington Times now, which is in turn quoting local health authorities. Death never arrived here on the anticipated scale. The United Nations has consistently overestimated AIDS in East and West Africa. That's right. There's not that much argument about it anymore. I mean, it's, you know, the facts are there on the table. If you want to look at it, you can have a look at it. As most people don't, because they think it's immoral, okay? South Africa is a different question. Here behind you is a graveyard in South Africa. This is the only country in Africa where it's possible to assess the theoretical claims made by the United Nations, made by the people I call the AIDS Boanas, against real-life death registrations. In South Africa, after all these years of looking at it, I'm afraid I'm no closer. I believe that there is evidence, compelling evidence, of a rise in adult mortality, taking place where you'd expect it, e.g. among young females who carry the highest burden of HIV infections. I would say by the same time, I'm not a scientist, but my impression is that I can't give you numbers, but that the real increase is much smaller than AIDS Boanas would have you. Let me put it this way. That the AIDS Boanas have a vested interest in maximizing and squeezing the data to get the worst possible scenario that they can out of it, because the worse the situation is, the more compelling their fundraising claims are. I think objectively, can I give you a complicated answer?
Yes.
I'm going to start this preamble so that you might be able to cut it.
Okay.
South Africa is unique in that everyone, all the experts agree that South Africa, uniquely in the entire third world, is a country with a viable death registration machine, one that actually works. All experts agree that between 80 and 90% of deaths that take place in South Africa are recorded by government, versus almost nothing in the rest of Africa. So they agree on that, very high levels of death registration. Where they disagree is, when did death registration reach these high levels? There's a faction who would say, led by Rodney Richards, is that after 1998, when the South African government started really pushing to include previously invisible black people in national statistics with major campaigns, that much of the rise in death seen in the statistics is an illusion generated by improving completeness of death registration. The AIDS establishment says rubbish. Deaths are rising. Here's the evidence. Himalayas and Alps of mortality in the graphs of South African death registrations. This is AIDS. Okay. This issue could only be resolved until somebody had settled this completeness of death registration issue. It was settled in May this year. Stats South Africa, which is our equivalent to the US Bureau of Census, came out with a paper saying that death registration had improved hugely in the wake of government reforms initiated in 1998. That among females, for example, death registration had risen from 62% to 87% over the years. An increase of that magnitude meant that the real increase in mortality in South Africa was negligible. I don't believe it doesn't exist. I believe it might, among the worst impacted females, be 30% rather than the 180 or 270% claimed by the AIDS Boanas. Then our Census Bureau turns around 6 months later. Here comes an American researcher apparently funded by UNAIDS to take part in what is billed, they explained to me is a collaborative effort between UNAIDS and the South African government. They massage the data and come out with a radically different answer. They say that death registration remains static or declined, and all that the increase in recorded deaths is real and scary. And what's more, they say that it's much more scary than even the South African AIDS researchers say. They say that rising deaths among females, females 20 to 24, are double what South African AIDS experts claim. Why are they saying this? They're saying this because the results that they achieve accord exactly with the results, with the theoretical sort of plague as portrayed by UNAIDS computer modelers. So UNAIDS, by securing the cooperation of South Africa's Census Bureau, has now put itself into a position where they say, our estimates have now been verified by real-life death registration in the only African country where that exists. I write to these people and I say, excuse me, you haven't explained this. 1 month you say one thing, next month you say a different thing. The conclusions are diametrically opposite and the consequences are dumbfounding. Could you please explain this to me? And they ignore you entirely. They roll your eyes and say, why, here goes Malan again. But, I mean, the questions are on the table, and listen, I'm on a whole deck. I'm a hack, I'm a journalist. I believe that if you work hard enough, you can uncover truth. And it seems to me quite clear that in many respects, people who work in AIDS don't want to face it. They don't want to answer these questions. They're very happy with the position they presently occupy in society. I think that's A very interesting operation. Yes, AIDS is definitely the most political disease in the history of our species. I think that's partly because of the way in which it started, where at least in the 1980s, it was a condition confined largely to the sort of gay and drug-using subcultures, and the egalitarian instincts of Europeans and Americans said, we can't have this. We must redefine this as an equal opportunity killer. The alternative would be to buy into conservative ideas that it was some sort of punishment for sexual deviance or whatever. So that gave it a political kickstart to charge off with. What you have in the third world, in a country like South Africa, is AIDS is actually a revolutionary utopian ideology. That when, for example, AIDS people do research, and recently there was a report in South Africa saying that 48% of Indian women in a place called Chatsworth were now HIV positive. If that's true, I'll eat one of these gravestones. But anyway, these claims are accepted as gospel by newspapers and reporters, etc. And they become claims. The consequence of those claims isn't simply that somebody should go there and care for the sick, which is a good idea. Go and care for the sick. Take pills, to anything to help people to make it better. It provides calls for comprehensive interventions in the lives of these people. Their sexual attitudes are wrong. The men must be re-educated. Because they're Indian and Hindu, they value boy children. So boy children are demigods in their lives, and girl children are ignored. This is evil. This is contributing to the climate in which this virus is spreading. These people's minds must be changed. Education must be taken over. The local hospital must be taken over. Media must be taken over to harp on this message. If you allowed in that microcosm AIDS activists to take over, you'd have a revolution. Everything would have to change. In other words, it goes way beyond just demanding medicine.
Now, one thing you said that was interesting was people actually accept these estimates kicked out by UN, AIDS, and World Health Organization as gospel. Isn't that right?
No, I initially did. When I entered this fray, my mission, I was retained by Rolling Stone magazine to assassinate our state president. I thought the easiest way to do it, this man must be an idiot. Everyone in Africa is dying of AIDS. I know this because I read the New York Times and Vanity Fair and so forth. It's beyond doubt. My very first action was to pick up the phone and call NASA because I wanted them to send me the satellite photographs of depopulated villages and untilled fields all across Africa where people had been wiped out by Africa. Didn't happen. My next action is I opened Johannesburg's Yellow Pages. I thought that I could illustrate the folly of our state president in questioning AIDS science, that I could illustrate this with a scene that began in a coffin factory in Johannesburg, where workers are working overtime trying to create caskets for these mountains of people who are dying of this condition. And I discover that in the midst of what UNAIDS says is a plague, is that half of the coffin factories in Johannesburg have gone bankrupt. And those who survive have no idea what's going on. They say to me, we read the newspapers, we should be rich. Business is completely flat. We don't know what's going on. You tell me. So, under those circumstances, I defy anyone. Are you interested in Thabo Mbeki?
Yeah.
I would say that in South Africa in 1999, at the time I acquired an interest in this, there was every hallmark that South Africa was in the grip of an epidemic of hysteria. That what foreigners, what the United Nations was saying about the extent of the plague in South Africa was ridiculously exaggerated. And I think that that's now verifiable, that at the time, Thabo Mbeki started sitting down behind his computer and surfing the internet to see what was going on and looking at the writings of Raznik and people like that. It's incredibly to his credit because something was fundamentally wrong somewhere. Are we going to respect this man where foreigners come and tell you there are 250,000 deaths in your country, the worst cataclysm in history of South Africa, and you can't find hard evidence of it anywhere? You can find anecdotes. Yes, anecdotes. Somebody will say, yes, well, I had a servant and she got very strange. It looked like AIDS to me, because she was only 28 and she got TB and then she died and I think it was AIDS. Yes, stories like that were commonplace, but any statistical corroboration of the society being stalked by a plague was at that stage, in 1999, was non-existent.
How does AIDS politics reverberate onto the African continent?
I'd say historically, there have been two chief consequences. One has been, as if you agree with Geneva, if you agree with the United Nations and you say, AIDS is a terrible problem, please God, send these white men to help us, and we will do prevention campaigns, etc. The consequence is that donations flood in, that you can... I somehow have the impression that AIDS prevention is the largest industry in Uganda, in the sense that it employs the most people. transforms the lives of ordinary people. I mean, this is, the doctors in Uganda who earn almost nothing, they make more money from their per diems attending AIDS conferences in the rest of the world than they do from doing their jobs. So I think in those ways, if you were a good African and you listened to the AIDS buonas, is you would be rewarded with like great showers of benevolence would come upon you. Lots of money would come in.
Hold on, please.
So,
Okay.
where was I?
You're talking about Botswana and the doctors,
Okay.
and they make more money with their per diems
Okay.
than they do.
No, so I think in sum that you would say that if you're a good African, if you brought the gospel according to UNAIDS and the World Health Organization, you'd be showered with benevolence from rich countries in the Northern Hemisphere. On the contrary, if you did what Thabo Mbeki did, I've never seen a politician in my look how grey my beard is, I've never seen a politician so eviscerated by a sort of lynch mob of journalists and self-styled AIDS experts as Thabo Mbeki, simply for daring to answer questions which I absolutely know were legitimate. As regards like mortality in South Africa, look, it's got nothing to do with whether or not HIV causes AIDS. I'm not interested in that debate. We were told HIV causes AIDS and AIDS is now killing 250,000 people in South Africa. That was not true. Thabo Mbeki noticed that. Is he not supposed to answer questions about it? Excuse me. That was not true. What is Thabo Mbeki supposed to do? Is he supposed to ignore it and pretend it's not really happening? I think it's much to his credit that he embarked on this particular sort of expedition of consciousness. I think he paid an extraordinary price for it. I don't know what his views are, because after a while he was shouted down he was such firestorms of ridicule that he had to shut up about it. So I don't know where his views arrive at right now. But certainly at that time, in the crucible of 98, 99 in South Africa, something was wrong somewhere, and I think it's justified that he did what he did. The Great African AIDS pandemic was essentially a sort of Northern Hemisphere story. It was this thing that fascinated European and American news organizations, and so they'd send reporters out to Africa. The reporters would get onto the plane armed with UN reports, which were control this dumbfounding estimates of theoretical infections, theoretical deaths, theoretical armies of information. You get off a plane in a place like Uganda and you go off into rural Africa, you're in a universe where you can't speak the language and where nothing that you brought with you psychologically, linguistically and culturally is really relevant. And what happens for those people is that journalism becomes a quest for images to illustrate the estimates emerging from Geneva. Geneva will tell you, to cite an example, Alexandra Shumatov's article in Vanity Fair about Rwanda quite a long time ago. It was entitled Search for the Fountain of Death. At that time, the United Nations was putting out these alarming claims. They'd done cursory HIV testing in the general population. They'd found astronomical levels of HIV prevalence. 80% among Rwandan prostitutes, 40 to 50 among truck drivers, and so on. So there's every appearance. The statistics appear to indicate that this country was experiencing a cataclysm, mega death. I mean, something on an unbelievable, incomprehensible scale. Shumatov went around the country, and you saw, as you can do at any time in the last many centuries in Africa, you want to find poor people who are starving or living in conditions of deprivation that are completely incomprehensible to the people watching this. You could have found them at any time. But anyway, he wrote this article in which he claims to have visited depopulated villages and hospitals where AIDS was the problem. And what's interesting about that story is that in retrospect, now that the Washington Post, among other authorities, and the health authorities in Rwanda would state that they believe that deaths of that scale never arrived, what was he seeing? Because, I mean, Shumatov, as I've read his writings elsewhere, is a really smart guy. I think that... Look, the same thing happens in South Africa. The other day somebody was telling me a horrible sight that they witnessed in some wretched hellhole in a place called Mthatha, on a rubbish dump, with all these AIDS pariahs, these desperately poor people sort of eking out a living amongst the scraps of a really poor society, while the crows, like the vultures, like hover above them, ready to eat their emaciated corpses, and attributing all this suffering to AIDS. And I've absolutely no doubt that the woman told me the story completely believes that that is what she was seeing. But was it?
So do you think that when journalists come from the West to report on African AIDS, their preconceived notions take over, and when they get here they see what they are already trained to believe?
I think the temptation would be to do that because they trust the United Nations. The United Nations, these people have doctor in front of their name and they wear white coats and they get published in major scientific journals. And as I myself, I don't believe they made mistakes. I think it's completely impossible to make mistakes. I'm a superstitious peasant like everyone else in this country. I believe in science. Or rather I used to. I have doubts now, at least. When it comes to mortality in Africa, everything is political. All the conclusions that you come to are fungible. It's like,
Okay. Where does AIDS mostly occur in Africa?
Well, 10, 15 years ago we were told that the fountain of death, the epicenter, was around Lake Victoria. And now, 3 months ago, as the Washington Post informed us that the actual epicenter is absolutely in South Africa, Southern Africa.
What about in terms of demographics? Do the white people get affected by AIDS in Africa, or is it the black people, the poor rural Africans?
This is one of the astonishing things about AIDS in Africa. We were told, like Americans were, that this disease was going to sort of cross all racial boundaries and consume and annihilate all of us. Somehow this has barely happened. The racial minorities in South Africa, HIV prevalence is measured by any measure is very low. And you'll have African people who are living across the street, among whom tests show that it's astronomical. I mean, this is one of the things that sort of... If you look at a city like Cape Town, where you have on the Cape Flats, as you might have visited these places, on the Cape Flats you have like sort of desperately poor African areas and desperately poor coloured areas, where all the problems, the levels of social dysfunction are exactly the same. There's like sort of lots of sexual assault, people drink too much, people take drugs. And on one side of the street you've got 15-20% HIV prevalence. That's among the Africans, and on this side of the street where the coloured people live, which is South African slang for people of mixed race, is the figures are negligible. So,
why do you think that is?
The AIDS pointers would tell you that's because people of different races in South Africa don't sleep together. I don't really think that's true. Listen. You don't ask me that question, I'm not a scientist, but I often have asked scientists, could it be that there's something in the genetic makeup of Africans or blacks in that occurs uniquely in African blood, for example, like the gene for sickle cell and anemia that might cause Africans to test HIV positive in such very large numbers? Because why does it happen in black South Africa? That's a better idea. We are ceaselessly told that if HIV prevalence is at this level, at the level it's supposed to be, it's because Africans in South Africa are a bunch of barbarians who, excuse my English, who fuck everything that moves, and they fuck their daughters, and they're all sexually promiscuous, and they can't control themselves, and they behave like animals, and that's how you drive up HIV prevalence to this level. There's no scientific evidence for that. Black South Africans are pretty sexually conservative, and maybe they lie to surveyors, but an epidemiologist called what's his name? An American epidemiologist calculated that it was physically impossible for Africans to have sex at the rates that would account for the rapid spread of HIV across southern Africa. You simply couldn't do it as often as was required.
Okay.
Well, if you're saying like Uganda, with a country destroyed by 20 years of civil war with no industry to speak of, and you decide that AIDS is your most central problem, and so suddenly the floodgates open and manna from heaven descends on you, billions and billions of dollars in the form of money to fight AIDS, and also armies of expats. You're going to come and live in your country to help you in the fight against AIDS, and they're going to spend money in South Africa, and suddenly things start happening. Restaurants open up, new business opportunities for everyone. AIDS in that respect has transformed Uganda. I believe that AIDS might be Uganda's biggest industry in the sense that it employs more people and sort of puts more money into society than anything else. So yes, under these circumstances, you'd have to be a very brave and maybe stupid African leader to say, sorry, we don't accept that we've got a serious AIDS problem, because the consequences are you'll be shooting yourself in the foot. The African countries that I've visited, to see the extent to which expats, this is sort of foreigners, well-educated whites from the Northern Hemisphere are actually in charge of all the AIDS programs, and who put out the sort of the groundbreaking research and what have you. It's like Africans are excluded from that level, but they get jobs as drivers and translators and interpreters and field assistants.
Well, with all the money coming into the country, can we at least say that hospitals are better staffed with qualified doctors and nurses with proper equipment and the much-needed antibiotics to treat other simpler diseases and infections?
That's an excellent question, because you can't. What's happening in southern Africa, in countries like Zimbabwe and Botswana and South Africa, is that Europe is poaching all our doctors and nurses. They don't want to live in Africa. It's a strange, uncivilized place with a lot of violence. So they're recruited and they go off and work elsewhere. So this is just one aspect of the South African health crisis. We're told by the newspapers that South African hospitals are in a state of advanced disintegration. Part of the problem is like lack of personnel. Part of it is just sheer disorganization, lack of proper management. Experts who understand this issue tell me that in spite of all the money being poured into AIDS, is that you can still go to rural hospitals throughout South Africa and not even find an aspirin. Well, as Mark Twain said, there are lies, and then there are damned lies, and finally at the very bottom there are statistics. And I think what he was referring to is this probably quite old habit of statisticians of manipulating the data in order to show a conclusion that's preconceived. I think that in AIDS in Africa there's been a very strong tendency to do that.
What basic questions should people ask when looking at AIDS statistics?
I would say the statistics were only of relevance at a time when there was this battle over what should be done with people who have this condition. It has now appeared to be accepted throughout the world: if they're sick, give them pills. No, give them the pills. Now, it's a different argument. The number of people who come forward to take the pills is very much lower than anyone expected. But it seems to me that is an arguably legitimate misuse, noble corruption, misuse of statistics, in order to convince people that there's one hell of a problem out there, guys, and we've got to go and do something about it. Beyond that point, it becomes irrelevant. The principle of treatment for the sick has been accepted now in Africa, and there's no need. I never ever want to hear another statistic again. There's no further route for this. They induce hysteria, I don't believe them, etc. I would like to hear of people taking practical action on the ground in desperately poor resource. I'd like to see people taking action on the ground to fight like the real problems of Africa, and like sort of this theoretical dogfight that's gone on for so many years about the accuracy of what's really going on in Africa is now irrelevant. Take that money away from the guys who are spending it on conferences in Thailand and give it to the poor, give it to doctors who are working for next to nothing in rural hospitals, man, please. Well, you open the New York Times and you see a story saying that 24 million Africans are infected with HIV. It doesn't imply that those people have been tested. It implies that they're linked via tortuous mathematical models to a woman who's tested positive in one of the sort of annual surveys conducted in African pregnancy clinics.
What do you mean by that?
Well, every year in South Africa, for example, in the month of October, researchers will go to certain pregnancy clinics and take blood samples from all the women who were there that day. And these are then sent to laboratories and they're screened for HIV infection. Usually in South Africa, in most parts of Southern Africa, the conventional thing is to use a single test with no confirmatory procedures. So we go back, and the first part of my answer is, you open the New York Times, you see 12 million people are infected with AIDS. This doesn't at all imply that 24 million Africans have been tested. It means that the experts assume that those 24 million people are somehow linked via tortuous mathematical models to a woman who tested HIV positive in one of the government's annual pregnancy clinic surveys. So what they do in South Africa, for example, every year, usually in the month of October, is researchers will go to pregnancy clinics and they'll take over all the leftover blood samples left by the women who visited the clinic that day. These blood samples are actually given to test for syphilis and other conditions that might affect the fetus. But these are anonymously taken away to laboratories. They're processed, they're tested for HIV. It's been the custom in South Africa for the last sort of several years throughout Southern Africa actually, to use a single HIV test determine whether or not this blood is really infected. Look, so I'm a layman, and so all I can tell you is that the people who make these drugs and the World Health Organization. Sorry, I'm a layman, so all I can really tell you is that the AIDS establishment holds that these tests are infallible, that they don't make any mistakes. They are. The manufacturers don't make such claims, but before they're deployed in Africa, they're usually test-driven by the World Health Organization at its labs in Belgium, and they all pass with flying colors. These tests are always infallible. But I can show you papers, sort of research conducted here in Maputo, the neighboring country, where you might as well toss a coin as rely on the outcome of a single blood test, because as these French researchers said, is that these tests have no power to discriminate in grey areas among people who have like sort of high levels of parasitic infection, and you get lots of false positives. But anyway, in southern Africa, it's generally assumed that every blood sample tested positive reflects a genuine HIV infection after one test only. And that data is then taken and put into a computer model, which is programmed to replicate a virtual HIV pandemic. The assumption is that if so many women are HIV prevalent, it surely follows that the infection levels in the general population must be something similar. And then it's because this disease is insidious and eventually kills you, it surely follows that X number of people have theoretically died in the past year. And then they've theoretically left armies of orphans in their wake. I mean, there was a time when the UN would issue pinpoint specific numbers, and they would say that in South Africa there were 250,742 AIDS orphans, which is simply not true. I mean, it's virtual reality. It's a theoretical construct arrived at in precisely the way I've just described.
Okay. Now, can you tell me about Dan Mulder and what he set out to accomplish in 1989 and why his study was so important?
Well, no, I think until Dan Mulder started doing his work in Uganda, there was a great deal of hysteria surrounding the subject. And rephrase. I think that prior to Dan Mulder starting his work, there was a great deal of conjecture and hysteria surrounding AIDS in Africa. What was groundbreaking about his work is that he decided we have to actually do a longitudinal mortality study. In layman's terms, he got a map and he drew a circle around 15 villages in rural Uganda, and then went there with an army of assistants, established a base camp, tested the blood of everyone who lived in that area, and then sat around for years to monitor the outcomes. So what Mulder did is they embarked on this long-term study. And for 5 years, these Western scientists and their assistants stood around with clipboards monitoring death. And they found that death rate among people who tested HIV positive was something like 10 times or 10 times higher than that in the normal population. And so, at first glance, this appeared to completely devastate the denialists, people who said there was no link between HIV disease and death, because Mulder appeared to have proved that conclusively. But what I did by mistake is I thought, well, now he's looked at this community and he's established that there's an overall death rate of 11 or 12 per thousand. How does this differ from historically? Because it sounded a bit low to me, so I went to the Ugandan government statistics office and looked up their census results, and it turned out that what he'd measured in those villages at a time what was supposed to be the apogee of Uganda's AIDS pandemic was the lowest death rate ever measured. Certain distance can offer you an explanation of that. Is that the HIV tests were supposedly picking out people who were going to die anyway because they were immune compromised for other reasons, that they had malaria or TB and they were sick. I don't know whether that's true, but I mean objectively, when the colonial authorities first started trying to assess the extent of mortality among rural Africans in East Africa and just after World War II, death rates were apparently astronomical, 40 to 50 per thousand. After the antibiotics revolution, they started declining. Every 10 years there'd be a census, and these would show continual steady improvements in sort of in life expectancy and decline in death rates. And Mulder's work sort of filled in that continuum. It's like everything went down for 40 years, and then at the bottom, the lowest death rate ever measured in that part of Uganda was Diane Mulder's mortality study. When Geneva and New York and those places started saying that AIDS was going to devastate Africa, that a certain kind of white South African was overjoyed. People made speeches in Parliament. I can cite you chapter and verse. They're saying, we don't mind, let Nelson Mandela go, unban the communists, unban the ANC. We don't care anymore because we've been reading the New York Times. The New York Times has informed us that by 2000 black people will be a minority in this country, and we, the rednecks, will be elected to power in democratic elections. This was a time when everyone believed that. Needless to say, yes, that particular, the quote I have in Parliament had in mind is the doomsday was supposed to be the year 2000. By 2000, 80% of black South Africans were supposed to have died. By the time 2000 arrived, everyone, including the AIDS boners, knew, of course, this was absolute nonsense. But they were issuing new, revised predictions. At that stage, the USAID and the US Census Bureau, in the course of 2000, issued a new prediction that South Africa's population would start shrinking in the year 2003. Well, 2003 is also history, and we live in the only African country where death registration takes place, and we know that that was also nonsense. So what do? They simply postponed the apocalypse for another 7 years. Now it's going to happen in 2010. You see, because South Africa is the only country in the third world where death registration must be taken seriously, it's forced sobering realities on HIV/AIDS modelers. Now, the people who live in Geneva don't care what South Africans say. We're just another rubbish African country. They can ride roughshod over us and issue estimates and tell the New York Times whatever they want. South Africa, on the other hand, we've got our own scientists here, and these scientists were looking at all the time, they're watching trends in South African death registration, and they're constantly realizing that the increase in death that they'd prophesied was not taking place, and consequently it was necessary to adjust their models. So what we've had in South Africa over the last, let's say, if you go back to the year 2000, there would have been only one AIDS model in Africa. It was UNAIDS model. This is the one that told us everyone was doomed and everyone was going to die. The first South African model, ASA 2000, which is constructed, that's ASA stands for the Actuarial Society of South Africa, came into being circa 2000. That model was soon discovered to be overestimating when compared to real-life death registration. So it was retired a year or so later in favor of something called ASA 2002. We were initially told that this model was now perfect, that it had been tuned to replicate reality, and was no longer really necessary for anyone, an arsehole like me, to look at real-life death registration, because the computer would now tell us everything we needed to know. But shortly thereafter, it turned out that this model was also overestimating. It too had to be retired and be replaced with a more advanced model. So if you look, historically, over the 6 years that I've been interested in AIDS, what you've had this incredible shrinking pandemic, is the overall magnitude of what we were facing and what we could anticipate has been lowered by AIDS researchers themselves. I mean, once again, but this is something that, that outsiders have never taken. It's not publicized. Generally, can I leave it there? This is a very good question. In America, where this problem was first notified, every death that takes place is registered. The only time people are buried without government being informed is if the mafia murders somebody and buries them in the backyard. Otherwise, all deaths in Europe and America are registered without exception, and death certificates are reliable, and there's none of this talk of stigma. So an AIDS death is what you see is what you get. These deaths take place in the 1980s in Europe and America, and to this day, an AIDS death is an AIDS death that takes place. It's recorded by government as such. Everyone knows exactly what they're looking at. Starting in the late 1980s, Jonathan Mann of the World Health Organization, he was the messiah of the AIDS religion. He was saying that this disease is going to clear the planet. We face a pandemic more mortal than any in mankind's history. And furthermore, he and his colleagues had found this in Africa, and everyone in Africa had it, using blood tests that the colleagues of theirs would now tell you were disastrously incorrect. But this idea came into being, but it was impossible to demonstrate what was happening. It was supposedly happening in countries like the Congo. It's a fictitious nation state. There was no government. It doesn't exist. Nobody could measure these things. So the activists and the advocates in Geneva had to find a way some way of demonstrating this huge and mortal threat that faced mankind. And they came up with this way of doing what they call sentinel surveillance, a sort of cursory, sort of half-assed way of doing things, where you take these anonymous blood samples from women and try and take one vial of blood, and it'll somehow come to represent 50,000 people in a computer model.
What would happen if AIDS establishment fell back on their actual hard statistics, the real statistics, not estimates?
The trouble is, there are no statistics elsewhere in Africa. There are statistics in South Africa, but the statistics here have been co-opted and corrupted by people with points to prove. I'd suggest what we do. It would be kind of nice to see it. Have an objective inquiry into death registrations in South Africa. Throw out the extremists who want to manipulate this, who want to manipulate us in terms of advancement. I think it'd be very interesting in South Africa to bring in objective experts who have no interest in manipulating us for their own vested reasons, and see what conclusion you come to. My feeling is that I feel that AIDS is a problem. There's something wrong in South Africa now. Young people are dying at AIDS at ages where it would not previously have happened. So I think it's a serious problem. How serious is anyone else's guess? And if people like Zaki Ahmed tell you that it barely matters if 50,000 people are dying of AIDS or 100,000, that's completely wrong. This is like statistics drive policy. Every government in the world, you don't know what your problems you're facing. This is why they have statistical services. This is the nature of the threat. This is our response to it. We're presently told every time I open a newspaper that our health minister, Mantasha Balala's head should be cut off because she's sitting on her plump rear while 750,000 people who could be saved if they were given HIV treatment timeously, while they go to their graves because the government is indifferent. Now, do those 750,000 people really exist? I mean, are they queuing up outside hospitals? They exist largely. They are estimates. These are theoretical AIDS cases that exist in the models. Do they exist in real life? We don't really know until somebody with objective scientists makes some sort of determination. I think you could do it in South Africa if there was the will.
So is this basically computer games?
I used that phrase. I said, to a certain extent, AIDS in Africa is a sort of computer game, and I paid a stiff price for it, inter alia, starting with my wife, who said, this is vicious, people are dying. It's not a joke. And it isn't a joke. This is desperately serious business, but it's... Well, I believe HIV causes AIDS because I'm just another superstitious peasant. I mean, I was brought up to believe that men with doctor in front of their name and white jackets and so forth, or some sort of high priests in our society, and that science simply doesn't make errors, certainly not of this magnitude.
What repercussions have you endured for questioning the stats of South Africa and the mortality?
Well, that's a very good question. Let me enumerate the charges that had been made against me. I was drunk, that I used drugs, that I was sexually deviant, that I was possibly homosexual, that I practiced incest, that I was an informer for a Zulu political movement called Inkatha, and lastly that I was mad. This was, reporters would come and say to me, how can you say things like this? Everyone's saying hundreds of thousands of people are dying of AIDS, and yet you're not. And then I'd sort of sit there for hours and explain all this to them and say, look, this is how I see it, here's this. And they get a bit confused, and then my wife would pitch up and I'd say, she thinks I'm mad too, and my mother. Everyone thinks I'm mad. I often think I'm mad, that I waste all my time doing this. They would go back and say, Malan admits he's mad. I often have doubts about my sanity. I think I might have some sort of congenital defect that comes from I come from a long tradition of Calvinist, Protestants. Martin Luther started all the trouble. He believed there was such a thing as truth, and then he nailed it to the door of the cathedral and caused shit for another 600 years. And I seem to have this a totally rational human being would have seen, well, I'm outnumbered thousands to one here, and the questions I'm asking upset people, so I would have given it up and gone on writing about pop music or something.
Looking back, do you regret getting involved in AIDS?
Profoundly. I've got a garage stacked with like scientific reports. My computer is clogged with scientific reports about AIDS. My brain is clogged with scientific reports about AIDS. I would have been a much happier person if I'd never got involved in this.
What are your thoughts on the South African journalist Rian Malan, who challenges the mortality of AIDS in South Africa and says the estimates aren't accurate and AIDS isn't really what it's said to be?
Well, you know, I mean, he's a bad writer, and he should stick to bad writing. But essentially what you need to look at is you need to look at the government Stats South Africa mortality report, which is, it's the only developing country, South Africa is the only developing country that has counted its death certificates to look at what the causes of death are. What I pointed out to you is that in 1997, most people died in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. By 1999, definitely by 2001 and way beyond 2003, for which there are death certificates available, most people were dying in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. There's no question that the Medical Research Council, Stats South Africa, the Actuarial Society of Southern Africa have said that last year there were at least over 300,000 AIDS-related deaths in our country. Now, no one can estimate exactly how many deaths there are. First, because most people don't know they have HIV. Second, people with AIDS, we die of TB, pneumonia, and other illnesses that people mostly survive if they're healthy. And so what gets recorded on a death certificate is not HIV or AIDS. What gets recorded on a death certificate is tuberculosis and or pneumonia and or meningitis or so on. So, I mean, apart from, I think it's unnecessarily giving credit to idiots to have to argue about people's graves, because in reality, I would much rather the problem be not as bad as it is.
So Zaki says I'm a bad writer. Well, last time they were taking me, they said I was an amusing writer, that I was a good read, but what I was talking about was deranged nonsense. So I seem to have sunk even lower in their estimation. He's completely. It's fine. You can describe me as a bad writer. The rest of that statement is the death certificates, that South African death certificates prove his case is simply not true.
Is it worth questioning? Is it worth re-examining one last time?
Well, no. There is no salvation if you're not prepared to look at the truth. It's only truth that will yield. If we don't diagnose our problems correctly, we can never ever hope to cure them. So for the last many years we've been told by experts in the Northern Hemisphere that AIDS is our most serious problem in Africa and that every available cent must be devoted to fighting this war. This is true. This is the legitimate argument if these estimates are correct. If it's not, it's a recipe for squandering billions of dollars while people starve right next to you. It's not. I mean, that seems to offer like the most eloquent justification I can. Truth is absolutely essential. You can never, no government in Africa will ever have wise policies unless they're based on analysis that's as close to truth as we can possibly come.